Thank you so much. It is really such a pleasure to be speaking to you today. I'm so sorry that I'm not there in person to have this conversation. Also, not only here, but those hallway conversations that are so important afterwards. So what I'd like to be talking to you today is about this evolving conversation in about ethics. And sadly, I will be providing this from an American perspective, and I hope to be learning more from you in question and answer about your own experience with this. So this is the question. What are ethical standards in documentary film? Great, so everybody knows the answer, right? The people whose pictures are shown in this picture are how most of us are feeling about the ethical standards in documentary film. In fact, in the US, there is no collective standards body that is providing these standards. Joke. There are standards and practices, guides that we get from journalism. And they come from two sources. One is from media companies, and I will be talking more about that later. And another one is from professional organizations that represent journalists. And I'm going to show you a website from the Society of Professional Journalists, which is the biggest professional body of journalists in the United States. They have developed a code of ethics which has 4 basic principles that are fairly uncontroversial. Seek truth and report it. Sounds very much like documentary. Minimize harm, always a good idea. Act independently, yes. Be the author of your own work. And be accountable and transparent. All sounds very good. However, these practices that are drawn from journalism are typically implemented in a way that is interpreted for daily journalism, which is quite different from the experience of most people who make documentary film. So they don't always mesh very well with documentary filmmaking. For instance, act independently often is interpreted as never pay your subjects. The idea is that if you pay your subjects, they're either going to, it will be a quid pro quo, it will be a delivery of services, or they will influence it. Never show the people you're interviewing your work in advance of getting it out in front of the general public, because they might disagree or influence it. Your priority is the public's right to know if this material damages somebody or hurts somebody. Let the chips fall where they may, because the public has a right to know. And that works really well when you're investigating a corrupt public official. And it doesn't really work as well when you're working with a traumatized individual, perhaps somebody who has been a whistleblower, or somebody who has experienced sexual assault in the workplace and is trying to tell a story about that which will help other people. So these journalistic standards have had an uneasy relationship with documentary film practice. Back in 2009, some of my colleagues and myself did interviews with around 45 working filmmakers, people who work produce documentary film for a living in the United States. And we asked them one question. That question was, when was the last time you experienced a situation in your work that raised ethical problems for you. So we were not asking them about ethical standards. We were not even defining ethics. We were just saying, what comes up for you if we say ethical problems? And what we discovered is that people were encountering ethical problems all the time, things that bothered them in their heart. They felt bad about doing it. And those problems came from the terms of the workplace. They were working for large companies. The companies were not paying enough for them to really do the job they wanted to do. They were often put on an assembly line. The person who was filming was not necessarily the person, was not necessarily in conversation with the person who was editing. They didn't have any control over how the material was ultimately used or reused, and they also felt they couldn't do anything about it. Back in 2009, we thought, well, now that we've exposed the problems that people are actually encountering, the field will want to react and create some kind of standards. Nothing could be further from the truth. People avoided the question of ethics in public continuously, as they had done in the past. There were lots of hallway conversations and whispers, and those conversations did not generate a wish to put themselves into a process of articulating standards. And I attribute that to the weakness of the filmmakers themselves in relationship with the large entities they need to work with to make and distribute their work. They are worried about endangering their future projects if they uphold standards that they fear will not be supported. And nonetheless, there have been a lot of questions about films. Back when Waiting for Superman was made, that is a film about charter schools, people asked, did you even check the statistics that you used in this film? Because they're all very in support of charter schools, which are licensed independent private schools supported by public money, as opposed to our public schools, which they become rivals for them, but they're private and independent outfits instead of being part of the local government. They're quite controversial, and this film was incredibly supportive of them, but its statistics were all wrong. Furthermore, the filmmaker who made it was provided with this opportunity by several funders who were themselves supporters of charter schools. So he wasn't, people said he wasn't really independent, but nothing bad happened because people raised those questions. The Act of Killing, people raised a lot of questions about. The Act of Killing is a film made by a then anonymous Indonesian and an American filmmaker about the atrocities in the early 60s in Indonesia, where a left-leaning government was supplanted by a right-leaning government. And there were reenactments of these horrible crimes. And there were a lot of questions about the use of those reenactments. More recently, people have raised questions about the film Zabývá, which is in which the filmmaker, it turns out, did not actually get informed consent from the Yazidi women who he made the film about. And they were put in danger by being exposed in this film. The same issues arose with a film called Jihad Rehab, which has now been renamed, in which informed consent was not provided, was not able to be provided, really, by vulnerable ex-Guantanamo prisoners in Saudi Arabia. And of course, Roadrunner is a film about Anthony Bourdain, a famous food critic who killed himself. And the director used artificial intelligence to mimic the Anthony Bourdain's voice. He didn't actually have recordings of a lot of what seems to be Anthony Bourdain's voice in the film. So these are all questions that people have, controversies, but they have not resulted yet in change. Trying to make it switch. Let's see, because I don't have it in the right format. Here we go. So why haven't filmmakers developed these ethics codes until now? I think there's a long history and a short history. The long history is that there's no tradition of formal ethics expectations in documentary film from its early history. There's a huge amount of government and advocacy money in the early history of documentary filmmaking, as well as commercial pressures. And John Grierson, the founder of British documentary, very calculatedly called it the creative treatment of actuality. And he wanted to say that because creative gave him a lot of leeway, while he was also arguing that the real stories being told had particular power and impact because they were real. In the post-war era, after World War II, the opportunities for independent film are actually very small, and broadcasters are the primary outlet. And they have standards and practices that are developed for their news, and they apply and constrain documentary film. That really changes when you have the arising of independent film. I'm speaking from a U.S. perspective in the 1970s, where people first are using independent theatrical venues, and then also you are using alternatives to broadcast, for instance, video cassette recorders, and then with the rise of cable. As the field grows, we have some fragile and unstable organizations that are unable to organize the field to do this. In the last 3 years in the United States, everything has changed. Suddenly, everyone is publicly talking about documentaries and ethics. What happened? So I think two big things happened. One is that the industry has changed with the rise of streamers. In the last 20 years, you see the boom in cable television. But cable television is now running for its life with the competition from streaming. Cable television typically documentaries were produced outside of the news division, unlike broadcast, and were capable of being entirely fact-free. You have, for instance, a show called the History Channel, a cable channel called the History Channel, which is full of science fiction and stories of space aliens. And that sets the stage for a ethics-free zone among the streamers. The owner of Netflix, Reed Hastings, has been open about the fact that he doesn't need to care about accuracy in documentaries that Netflix shows. And he says, I'm not in that business. If I were the New York Times, I would have to care, but I'm in the entertainment business. And at the same time, you'll note that documentaries have the particular force they have because they make a claim to truth. So that claim to truth is kind of their DNA. It's their reason to be. It's the way they distinguish themselves from other kinds of filmmaking. And yet, the streamer's attitude is it's just entertainment. So that's the industry trends have created a situation where more and more controversies, like the kind that I just described, are bubbling up, and people are more outraged than usual. But the other big thing that happened is that the racial reckoning that we are going through in the United States, which that is the recent racial reckoning is merely the surfacing into a larger public conversation of the fact that our country was founded on slavery, and some form of slavery and subhumanization has been a feature of American culture ever since. And the death of Mike Brown in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, began a mobilizing of Black and Brown people and their allies to change the conversation. In the last few years, that conversation has landed very, very heavily in the documentary world. I put up a picture here of some news that really set off a very big conversation. And that is when one of our major filmmakers, Alex Gibney, who runs a company called Jigsaw Productions, announced that they were making a film about Tiger Woods, the golfer. Tiger Woods is famous as a multi-ethnic star on the sports circuit. The fact that he has multiple ethnicities is absolutely key to his fame. And yet this film was being made with not one person who was a person of color in the filmmaking. So filmmakers of color said, what's going on here? The two things happening at the same time, the racial reckoning and the changes in the industry, have actually brought a set of responses. First, I'd like to talk about corporate responses. Both the broadcasters, and I personally know both our public broadcasting service, which is a distribution service for public broadcasting, PBS, and one of the networks, NBC, are actively re-looking at their standards and practices to see how they apply to documentaries. The corporate people are very aware that there is an uneasy fit between their expectations for journalism and their expectations for documentary. And they want to honor the fundamental ethical values rather than the specific ways that they have been implemented in the past. One of the responses, and I will take you to the PBS website now. Well, I say that I'm going to do that, but am I? Where are you? Here we go. For the first time ever, PBS decided to make its standards and practices public to the general public and explain how they interpret each one of these values, which are independence, accuracy, fairness, transparency, inclusiveness, and accountability. And PBS is thinking at this point about how these concepts can be honored in the documentary situation. And the same thing is going on at NBC. So there's a corporate response which is driven, actually, I think, less by racial reckoning and more by industry changes. All the broadcasters are in a very vulnerable position because they're losing audience share very quickly. Also, the people who they always believed they had in the palm of their hand, documentary filmmakers, who needed them more than the broadcasters needed the filmmakers. Suddenly the filmmakers have options. Suddenly they have other places to go. And so corporate actors are looking to make more friends among filmmakers and say, really, you should work with us, not Netflix. At the same time, a number of new organizations have arisen in the last few years among filmmakers. And this is much more of a response to the racial reckoning, I think. It is a gathering of strength, of collective strength, by filmmakers who have historically been the less well represented in documentary filmmaking. It helps a lot in a field as precarious as documentary filmmaking if you come from privilege, if you have money. And so it really is no shock that documentary filmmaking in the United States is dominated by white men. But there are still lots of other people who want to make films and who want to tell stories that have not been told, including by white men, from a viewpoint that is speaking directly from their experience. And I'm going to show you some websites again that show some of these different organizations. Let's see, here's an organization of disabled filmmakers. Here you see somebody who is sight impaired who's working with a dog. Forgot the word for the dogs that are service dogs, that's right, who help people who are disabled. They have created something that I think is extraordinary, which is this toolkit. If you just Google this word, FWD/doc, I think you will not have any trouble finding this toolkit, which is very helpful for explaining how to both incorporate disabled people's perspectives and working to increase the number of disabled people who work in your films. Another organization is filmmakers who are undocumented. That is a kind of a code word in the United States for people who do not have citizenship or legal papers authorizing them to live in the United States. There's a lot of them. And this collective is not only they are not only finding each other, but they are also developing a code of best practices in how to work with undocumented people in your films. In other words, this is a care-centered perspective on how to make sure that your work as a filmmaker is not damaging somebody who is undocumented. There's a group called Beyond Inclusion. Beyond Inclusion is a group of people. BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This is a group of BIPOC filmmakers who are pressuring corporations. They started with public broadcasting to have more people of color represented in their decision-making process and more stories of and by people of color in their distribution process. They are in active conversation with public broadcasting right now. As well, you have labor organizations. This is one example of documentary editors. Documentary editors have recently issued a statement to the industry saying, please recognize how much time you need to allocate in your budget for editing, because you're not allocating enough time, and the editing actually for a documentary is by its nature going to take a lot more time than your other forms. Reality television is a completely different thing. So that is starting a new conversation in the field. And then there's the organization that I belong to, which is BIPOC-led. It's led by people of color, and it's called the Documentary Accountability Working Group. And I want to spend the rest of my time with you talking about that work. We just released a document that we've spent 2.5 years working with the documentary field to create, which is a framework, an ethical framework that we're proposing for the field. And it's not, we see it as the beginning of a conversation rather than a fiat document telling people how to behave. This is entirely designed around another term of art, another code term that is very big in the field in the United States right now, non-extractive filmmaking. And what extractive filmmaking is when you're not a member of the particular group you're telling a story about, parachute into their world, take their stories, don't consult them about how the story will be told, and then sell that story to people who also don't know anything about that world. And the example that people use for that is the Tiger Woods documentary. So non-extractive filmmaking, what would that look like? Supposing you are going to be making it about, with, or for members of underrepresented or minoritized or oppressed groups. We started with creating values, as all ethical statements do. You've seen a couple of examples of that already with the PBS and the Society for Professional Journalists. And these 6 values, which I'll let you take a look at now, is our core to thinking about how to make non-extractive work. So they include: be actively working against oppression. It's not enough to say, I'm a good person. You have to acknowledge that oppression is built into our society. And if you are going to not be oppressive, you're actually going to have to do work. Be transparent. Be clear about what you're doing. And acknowledge that as a filmmaker, even if you're poor, even if you're BIPOC, you have a real power that the people who are in your film will not have. So go an extra mile to respect the dignity and the agency of the people in your film. Agency meaning they have a capacity to act. They're not your subjects. Put care for them as a priority, and not just them, but the people who you're working with, the people who you're responsible to. Have a 360-degree perspective about making sure that you are careful. Remember that you're making work for people who are not going to know all the backstory of how you did it. Make sure that you are concerned to honor the audience's expectations, that you're telling them the truth about something that's important for them to know about. This framework then goes through 5 stages of production. And probably the newest innovation in this document is that it starts with reflection, meaning that as a filmmaker, the first thing you do is ask yourself, why am I interested in making this film? What are the relationships that I need to have to make that film? Am I the person who should be making this film if this is what I want to do? And for each of these, we create a series of questions that people can ask themselves. We don't provide answers for how anyone should do it, because every situation needs its own process of reflection. Every set of relationships is different. But these values can be maintained by asking yourself some questions. And in each case, we provide one example of somebody who has done this and how they did it. That example is not meant to say, this is how you have to do it. It says, this is how one person thought about doing this in this way. So if we put those values into action, I'm going to give you 3 examples. First, this ban on compensating your interviewee, which comes from the expectation, the general expectation that you're not going to either overly influence or be influenced by the people that you're telling the story about. Well, are you paying them, or is what you're doing defraying the cost that is absolutely required in order for them to participate? In some cases, for instance, mine, you wouldn't need to defray my costs, because participating in a film as some kind of ethics expert is basically part of my job anyway. I do get paid, but if your participant in your film is an underage, a young Black kid who wants to play basketball, as was the case in Hoop Dreams, you might think about defraying their costs, because their family is poor. Their family can't afford to do things like take a day off work or pay for a taxi to get to the place they need to get to. So I put here some things that people think about that are directly in relationship to defraying necessary costs. All of these are currently banned by people who do have standards and practices, but they make good ethical sense. So one way of defraying costs is to say, oh, do you have some pictures of your family, of your child when he was young? I will pay you for those in the same way that I pay a footage house for licensing rights. Oh, am I filming in your home and using your electricity and taking up your time? Let me pay you a location fee. Oh, do you have to get a babysitter to be able to talk to me? I will cover the cost. You had to take time off work. Maybe I'll think about how I can either use these other ways of covering that cost, or even openly pay you for whatever the equivalent is. Oh, am I asking you to come to the festival, and they're paying for your travel, but you need to get housing or you need to eat while you're there? Let me give you an honorarium or a stipend to cover those costs, including the time you'd have to take off from work. So in that sense, let me go back to that slide for a moment. We're talking about putting our values into action by realizing that people are suffering a real cost for participating with us because they have a history of oppression or minoritization. That means they aren't as privileged as someone like me. Another example, how can you have a care-centered process toward participants? Many things that filmmakers currently actually do, but kind of quietly, are not regarded as current standards and practices. For instance, I'm going to tell you what the process of making a documentary is like. You think I'm going to just come and interview you and leave, but actually this will be a process that if you invest in it could take months. I'm not even sure the film will get out in public, but it's going to take a while. Also, I will talk to you for a long time. I will be there in your family for a long time, but very little of it will end up on screen. All of this is new to people who've never been around media. Usually filmmakers come in and just have a release signed, a statement that says, I agree to have my image used in perpetuity for any purpose. You know, these release documents created by lawyers, which are actually, if you ever read them, quite intimidating. What often people are doing in practice is honoring people's experience. Sometimes people change their minds. That can be expensive for a filmmaker, but at the same time, to have somebody in your film who has said, I can't afford to have this be out in public, and now I understand the implications, I can't do it. That is actually what happened in Jihad Rehab. The filmmaker was working with an ex-Guantanamo inmate who was in a rehabilitation center in Saudi Arabia, where that person could never leave. And one of those people walked out of the filmmaking during an interview. And the filmmaker actually put his earlier interviews in and the section where he walks out. And he was very surprised that he had stayed in the film. He was not happy about it. Sometimes people are actually adding into their budgets a mental health counselor of some kind, a therapist perhaps, to make sure that somebody is thinking about what it means to have, for instance, the experience of retelling a horrible thing that happened to you for the camera. People make decisions that are perhaps less good for the film, but are necessary to preserve the safety or security of their participant. For instance, in a film about lynching, in the modern day, Jackie Olive was working with a woman whose son was lynched. And she lives in a small town that is racially divided. Some people in that town were angry at her for charging that this was lynching. The police were like, clearly a suicide, and very hard to believe that that was a suicide. So Jackie, instead of filming this woman in her own home, which would give you a lot of information about this woman that you might really want, a rich experience as a documentarian, took her to another town so that the filmmaker and the filmmaker's equipment wouldn't be seen around there, so that she could stay under the radar. And sometimes people make a choice to not include information that might be damning or upsetting for people, but is not relevant to this story. An example of putting these care-centered values in action as well is how much you should maintain independence and be your own person telling this story, but does that mean you have to completely pay no attention to what participants in your film think? That goes against people's ethical instincts here. So what actually does happen, again, quietly at the moment, people aren't telling each other until now, is that people do show their participants either sections of the film or the whole film before there's a public screening. Even though publicly they might say, oh no, we didn't do that, they do it. Some people are offering producer credits for film participants who have a big role in the story. An example is a new film called Subject, and it is about the lifelong consequences of being in a documentary film. The 5 subjects, the filmmakers call them participants, not subjects. But they call the film subject because they want to draw attention to the fact that these people's humanity was made secondary to the way in which they were used in the filmmaking process. The filmmakers worked so closely with the participants that they gave them all producer credits. In some cases, although this is much more rare, people give back-end payments once the film is out for the revenues, some portion of the revenues back to participants. That is what happened in Hoop Dreams. Once Hoop Dreams made money, which was a big shock to the filmmakers, all of the participants in the film got a share of the profits according to how many times they were on screen and how many words they said. That left the 2 boys who were the stars of the film in a position to have lifelong, life-changing money. So that's my presentation to you. I would be really eager to hear how you're looking at this as well, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Patricia. Now Thank you, and now I will turn to Czech again, and it will be translated for you. Takže nyní je prostor pro otázky od kohokoliv z vás. Můžete je pokládat v češtině nebo v angličtině, jak vám libo. Prosím, jestli máte už někdo něco na jazyku, tak já vám to rovnou...
Já možná radši česky. No, jasně. Dobrý den, díky moc za strašně zajímavou lekci. Chci se zeptat, zaujala mě všechno, ale úplně nejvíc mě zaujaly vlastně ty poslední 3 body o tom, jakým způsobem napravit vlastně ty poměry vůči postavám a zúčastněným při výrobě filmu. Neznám americké poměry a proto se ptám, nakolik se toto už uplatňuje, dejme tomu, v grantových žádostech nebo dotačních žádostech při té předprodukční fázi, když chci peníze na film, nakolik dnes v USA je možné toto zohlednit, že například postavy přijdou do střižny, konzultují s ním střih a tak dále, nakolik tohle může být už součástí těch finančních plánů, nakolik se toto třeba stalo i už nezbytným standardem.
That is a great question. So the things that I was describing in the last 3 points, which were ways of implementing this care-centered process, those are 3 hot buttons right now in the field. So what we discovered by talking to filmmakers all over the country over 2 years was that people are actually doing this when they're making a certain kind of film. A film where they are telling a story with, by, or for members of an oppressed or minoritized or underrepresented group. And the fact that so what we saw was actually, this is quite common. That means it's kind of creeping up on being some kind of a norm, but everybody who's doing it thinks that they are sneaking around. We only released this document on September 21st. And we thought, when we released it, that it might be quite controversial. What we've been discovering, although I still think that there's plenty of controversy, what we've discovered is that there was a kind of big sigh of relief in the field. And we think that we are beginning to have, for the first time, an open conversation. So one thing that has happened is that the MacArthur Foundation endorsed the framework, this document, which is arguing for a care-centered approach, without telling people exactly what that means. That means that the MacArthur Foundation is committing to, when they fund in the documentary area, to fund with this in mind, such that if you put a line item in for expenses of your minoritized participants, that will not come as a surprise to them, and they would think that that was a good idea. There's also something called a common application among the private funders for documentary. And the common application has now been changed to incorporate questions about how you are approaching questions of care and concern, particularly for your participants. Now, does that mean it's going to be easy to raise money, for instance, when you're doing an advocacy or an outreach or an engagement campaign? Is it going to be easy to fund your participants' travel and participation in festival events? I think it's all going to be difficult the first time and the second time and the third time that anybody does it. But what we have seen in the past with different kinds of standards and practices documents is that norms change when discussion is public and significant actors make the change. Another very important primary endorser of the framework was the Independent Television Service, ITVS.org. I'm a very proud board member of that organization, and it's the major organization in public broadcasting that co-produces documentaries. There's probably, I don't know if there's an ITVS representative at this festival, but they often do go to festivals. ITVS has endorsed the document, which means that ITVS will be scrutinizing budgets to see whether the financing for the film enables an actually care-centered practice. But we are only 1 month out from releasing this document, and we think that the way to be able to answer your question, I don't think there's a way to answer that question for the next few years, because I think I will be surprised if this is less than a 5-year process to start incorporating these expectations more generally into the field. But the way setting expectations starts is by increasing the conversation. And let me just point out that being able to be here with you is one way of doing that. I wish that I could tell you that producing this document waved the magic wand, and now filmmakers will be able to afford to have a care-centered practice. But I think the answer to the ethical questions around this is not to say I can't afford it.
Děkuju. Další dotaz, tam vzadu.
Hello. Okay. So I always wondered, what if you would make like a documentary about a person who has like a great trauma, like a big trauma, and eventually while you're filming, you're talking about the trauma, and the person gets like a breakdown, and eventually you use it in the film. Would you be like a bad person for like using the part of the breakdown of the person?
That's another great question. And I want to start by asking you what you think.
Well, my point of view, because I'm a student filmmaker, and I would use it just because it's a great way to show this person and what the person has been through. But on the other side, you use something very the most emotional side of this person, and I have actually no clue about, is it good, is it the right thing to do? But for the film it would be good, but for the person itself and for the family, I don't know.
Right. Am I frozen on the screen, or are you seeing me?
Yeah.
It looks like I'm frozen.
We see you. We see you.
Okay.
Yeah, we can
Good.
see you.
All right. So when I'm looking at, my picture is frozen, but maybe you can see me moving. Can you see me waving my hand? No.
Yes,
Okay,
Yes,
but
we
you
can
hear
see you.
everything is okay.
All right, good. So I think asking yourself the question, what values are you upholding by doing that? Clearly, you're showing somebody being deeply vulnerable and upset. So is there some other value that is so important that it's worth re-traumatizing that person every time somebody sees the film and they have to be around it? Sometimes maybe yes. If the answer is that was a really great emotional moment that will be satisfying and also kind of entertaining, that doesn't seem to me an ethical value that trumps the value that you should honor somebody's humanity. Another question I have is, why did that person break down in the scene? Why did they have a meltdown when talking about this? Was there something you could have done to make it less horribly upsetting for somebody to go through that? Is there some way that you could create an emotional journey that you take the viewer through that did not involve creating a horrible moment for that person? So I think those are care-centered questions. They don't tell you, there's no cookie cutter answer for what the best answer is. There's a film, I've now forgotten the name of it. Never mind, I'm not going to tell that story, it'll be too long. But yes, people have made a decision to show a moment of breakdown. They in the case I'm thinking of, which I wish I could remember the name of the film, that It was about a pastor in America's heartland who was doing good work with migrant laborers in the oil fields, and it's discovered that he's also having sexual encounters with the men in this shelter that he runs, and the filmmaker accidentally did catch that material, and then he had a real heart-to-heart discussion with the pastor about whether the pastor wanted that material in the film. Ultimately, the pastor did decide that he would accept the film, the material being in the film for his own reasons. But the filmmaker was ready to not use it, although he was going to be sad if he didn't use it, because he was concerned about ethical, care-centered practice.
Tak, ano.
But as a filmmaker, you're just at the beginning of a journey where every time you're making a film, you have to ask those questions. And it's important to realize that they're good questions to ask. They don't have cookie cutter answers, but they're important.
Yeah, we have another question.
Good afternoon, Pat. I think it might be midnight there, but you introduced me to a concept of perfect cinema and imperfect cinema about 40 years ago. And
Yes.
and I'm wondering whether these discussions are we also striving towards a perfect and imperfect documentary way of making films. Now, of course, documentary is more unpredictable, and therefore the cultural milieu where you're shooting also makes a very big factor. And when I see your list of suggestions how to improve, like compensating for the time that the family takes off to be on camera. But I think, of course, in America, everything is much more quantified. Your time, every time you have to find a babysitter. Maybe in a country where there's more of the extended family, these are not issues. But I think it's important for you're battling for that there's no exploitation, since a lot of film is being made by television money or producers' money. But would we be moving towards a more perfect or a better way of doing documentaries, if besides these, you just use the word respecting the humanity? I think that's the key word here, and everything else is a next step if you quantify them into respecting also how much time they've lost. So probably my whole question was the cultural milieu within which we're shooting doesn't display a much bigger factor in the way we would interpret the code of ethics that you are bringing out, and find a more common ground based on this cultural differences, but still respecting the humanity of the subject and the final story that you want to tell about them.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think it's very important to understand context in any ethical question. There are situations that you can imagine very easily where none of this would apply in the same way. If you're making a film about Elon Musk does not need to be compensated for his time off. If you're, certainly the examples that I gave of how people are dealing with these problems reflect the incredible immiseration of the American working public over the last 40 years. I think that immiseration is leads directly to the kind of Trumpian politics that we are now seeing with such terror in our countries. And I think that same neoliberal approach has you can see it worldwide. But yeah, I can imagine a situation where that's not your question, but you have other questions that you know about because you know what the culture is. This is also the place where asking yourself if you're the person to make that film is relevant, because if you don't understand the cultural parameters of what's at stake or what's involved by telling that story, you're not in a good position to understand what a care-centered approach really is. So yeah, I think cultural context is very important, and that's another reason why, first of all, I make the point that I am coming from an American perspective and context. But second, it's why we don't prescribe how to implement these values specifically, but rather give people some questions to ask that allow them to be reflective. And maybe those aren't the right questions for you, but maybe that's your challenge in your context to figure out, well, what are the relevant questions here? In terms of perfect and imperfect cinema, that comes from a manifesto written by Julio Garcia Espinosa, who is one of the founders of of Cuban cinema in nationalized Cuban cinema. And what he's basically arguing is that we need to have a cinema that is more related to the political and social context and responsive to it. Certainly, what is driving the ethics conversation in the US today for the people coming from the racial reckoning side is a deep awareness that expression has enormous ideological and political implications. And we can't pretend that it's just entertainment. And we have to be honest in acknowledging where power is and how it flows. That doesn't mean that everybody's doing political advocacy. It just acknowledges that public expression is always some kind of ideological intervention, even and maybe especially when it's entertainment. Thank you for that question.
Taky děkuji za otázku i za odpovědi a teď je prostor pro poslední otázku. Last question. Tak pokud někdo máte, if you have anyone, okay.
Thank you very much for the talk and having this American perspective. I think in Europe it's still quite, the practices are not as criticized and challenged, so it's very refreshing to see this. I was wondering what your point of view was on the next steps also of these conversations. A lot of it is a lot of this sort of conversation is carried by directors, especially, and they're the ones also carrying most of the, let's say, the responsibility around this care-centric thing. And how do you think that other members of the filmmaking team and production and even the structures that we have can support this kind of changes?
What a great question. Yeah, is this just the director's responsibility? What about the producers? What about the editors? What about the people working on impact? What about the people who are funding it? What we expect to be doing in the next year, in which I dearly hope that we get enough funding ourselves to be able to hire somebody to maintain the momentum, because all of us have jobs. What I hope we do is to work with institutions in every one of those areas to foment those conversations about what does that mean for us. Editors obviously are not there in the beginning of the process, but they are crucial to asking questions about representation and inclusion of material as the film gets made. And many editors are often, put in the position of making those ethical calls without necessarily having had until now some language to support their arguments. So I think we are also in conversation with more private funders, not just MacArthur, and there are also entities like Sundance Film Institute in our country where and Chicken and Egg Productions, which we hope to be in conversation with, that support film and channel funding. The International Documentary Association. We are just beginning the conversations, but I think it's really important to get institutions across the entire process of making a film to be both in conversation with filmmakers, but also with each other. And that's one reason why we were so excited. MacArthur did fund some of this process of building this framework, and we're really hoping that since MacArthur is such a powerful funder in this country of documentary, that they will be able to start having conversations with other funders. But as I say, this work is just beginning, and one thing that will really make it affect how this rolls out is whether Documentary Accountability Working Group gets funding to actually develop those conversations with all the different actors. But I'm hopeful. There is a lot of enthusiasm for this.
Thank you, Patricia, for a lot of inspiration. We have run out of our time, so thank you. And thank you, the audience, for the questions.
Thank you very much. Have a great festival.